You're doing this wrong, not because you're broken, not because your approach is fundamentally flawed, but because you've been working with incomplete information about how avoidant attachment actually heals. You've probably been told that avoidants need patience, that they need space, that if you just give them enough time and understanding, their walls will eventually come down. And so you've been patient. You've given space. You've swallowed your own needs to make room for theirs. And nothing has changed. Or worse, things have gotten worse. The research is clear on this. Studies from the University of Toronto's Attachment Lab, along with work coming out of UC Berkeley's Social Psychology Department, show something most people miss entirely. Avoidant attachment doesn't heal through more softness or more space. It heals through a very specific kind of psychological pressure. Not pressure change, but pressure that forces their entire system to reorganize itself from the inside out. I work with clients on this constantly. I see people who have spent years trying to love an avoidant partner by being smaller, quieter, less demanding. And I watch their frustration grow because the strategy backfires every single time. They make themselves easier to be around, and the avoidant becomes easier to avoid. They reduce their emotional presence, and the avoidant becomes more defended. The fundamental problem isn't that they're doing something wrong. It's that they're approaching this without understanding the actual mechanism that creates change in an avoidance nervous system. Here's what's happening by the end of this video. You're going to understand exactly what that mechanism is. You're going to see why the approaches that seem logical actually keep avoidants locked in their patterns. And more importantly, you're going to know the specific conditions that actually force an avoidance psychological system to rewire itself, not in a manipulative way, in a way that's backed by how human attachment actually works. But what does it actually mean for an avoidant to heal? What happens when someone who has spent years successfully keeping people at a distance suddenly encounters something their defenses cannot handle? When emotional walls that have always worked stop working, when the deactivation strategies that have protected them from intimacy just fail, I'll tell you what happens. Something that's been locked behind years of emotional regulation and learned self-protection suddenly has no mechanism left to hold it back. And it doesn't trickle out slowly over months of therapy. It floods. The avoidant doesn't gradually become more comfortable with closeness. Their entire system reorganizes around a new reality. That connection doesn't equal danger. That's not a fairy tale. That's attachment psychology. And there's a specific set of conditions that triggers it. Now here's what makes this so counterintuitive. When an avoidant never encounters the conditions that actually create systemic change, when they spend years successfully avoiding the very thing that could dismantle their defenses, when the strategies that have always protected them are never challenged in the right way, they don't just stay the same. They get more defended. The emotional walls that were built for protection become prisons. The capacity for genuine intimacy never fully develops. Relationships become a series of controlled interactions where real vulnerability never enters the picture. And over time, the avoidant stops even recognizing what they've lost. The disconnection becomes normal. It becomes their identity. This isn't inevitable. This is what happens when we misunderstand the mechanism of avoidant healing. Because here's the truth that most therapists and attachment experts won't say out loud. Being endlessly patient when avoidance distance doesn't heal them. It enables them. It confirms their deepest belief, which is that keeping people at arm's length works, that they can have relationships without risk, that their system was right all along. Real healing happens when that belief gets challenged, not attacked, challenged, and that's a very different thing. Most people assume that avoidants heal through safety and reassurance. The logic seems airtight. Avoidants learn to be distant because closeness felt dangerous in childhood, so you create a safe environment. You prove you're not going to hurt them, and eventually they'll let their guard down, right? Wrong. And here's why. For an avoidant, most relationships are manageable because most people are ultimately predictable, even caring. Loving people telegraph their needs clearly. They pursue when they want closeness. They withdraw when they're hurt. They create patterns the avoidant can read and respond to without ever actually being vulnerable themselves. Psychologists call this the regulation loop. The avoidant unconsciously selects for dynamics they can manage and unconsciously distances from anything that threatens that management. So when you show up being endlessly patient, endlessly understanding, endlessly willing to wait, you're not creating safety. You're creating predictability. And predictability is exactly what keeps the avoidance defenses intact. What actually breaks the loop isn't more patience. It's encountering someone whose emotional reality cannot be managed, cannot be controlled, and cannot be kept at a safe distance without real loss. Not someone who's chaotic or unstable. Someone who's so grounded in their own truth that the avoidant's usual strategies just stop working. That presence doesn't trigger the avoidant's fear of engulfment. It triggers something they've rarely felt. The fear of losing something real. And that fear is what creates the pressure for change. This is the part where we need to get specific, because understanding the theory isn't enough. You need to see how this actually unfolds in stages. Stage 1 is disruption. In the first interactions with someone who's truly grounded, the avoidant feels something unusual. Interest without threat. There's no pursuit, no emotional demand, no sense that this person needs them to be anything other than what they are. The avoidant's nervous system registers this as safe. And because it feels safe, they lean in slightly. This is the opening. Most avoidants don't even realize it's happening. They just notice they're thinking about this person more than they plan to. Stage 2 is confusion. Around a point where the avoidant would normally pull back and reset the distance. Something doesn't work. They go to deactivate, to create space, to reestablish their emotional autonomy. And they find that the other person isn't chasing, isn't asking questions, isn't trying to pull them back. The usual script doesn't play out, and that registers as deeply unsettling, because now the avoidant is the one feeling the absence. They're the one noticing the space. And that's not how their system is supposed to work. Stage 3 is system failure. This is where the avoidant's internal architecture starts to crack, because the person they're dealing with holds space without clinging. They're present without demanding reciprocity. They have their own emotional center that doesn't shift based on the avoidant's behavior. And this short-circuits the avoidant's primary defense, which is a belief that closeness always comes with a cost. The feelings they've been keeping regulated start surfacing without permission. Thoughts they would normally suppress stay present. The usual tools for creating distance stop being effective. Stage 4 is reorganization. If the grounded person stays consistent, doesn't collapse into the avoidant's distance, doesn't start chasing or explaining or performing, the avoidant reaches a point their system has rarely, if ever, encountered. They want someone they cannot simply manage. And that wanting doesn't stay quiet. It builds pressure. And eventually, the pressure becomes greater than the fear. This is when the avoidant stops being defended. This is when the healing actually begins. Not because they've been convinced that intimacy is safe, because they've encountered something their entire system wasn't built to walk away from. Now, here's something that needs to be said, because this belief keeps so many people from understanding what actually helps avoidants heal. It's tempting to think that being the person who creates this pressure means you have to do something, perform something, manage something, strategically withhold your emotions or your presence to force a response. And that discomfort makes people abandon exactly what makes this process work in the first place. But what creates healing in an avoidant isn't a strategy. It's a way of being. And the difference matters more than almost anything else I'm going to say in this video. A strategy is something you execute to produce an outcome. You do certain things, avoid other things, calibrate your responses to get the result you want. What we're describing is something you embody because it's already true about you, a depth of self-awareness, a capacity to stay grounded in your own emotional reality, and a refusal to abandon that reality just to keep someone else comfortable. Real performing looks like this. You mirror the avoidance detachment until you've hollowed out your own needs. You study their attachment style like it's a manual. You act unbothered in every text while internally checking their response time every 10 minutes. You make yourself smaller and quieter and less emotional, all while telling yourself you're being strategic. That's not being grounded. That's self-abandonment with a psychology label on it. The difference matters. Because the moment this becomes a persona you're maintaining, it loses everything that made it effective. Avoidants don't heal in the presence of someone performing groundedness. They heal in the presence of someone who actually is grounded. Someone whose emotional center doesn't shift based on the avoidant behavior. Someone who doesn't need the avoidant to change in order to be okay. You can't fake that, and you shouldn't try. So, how do you actually hold space for avoidant healing without losing yourself in the process? Because here's the truth. The thing that creates the conditions for change is also the thing that makes you most vulnerable to collapse. When the avoidant goes distant, and don't explain yourself. Don't fill the silence with reassurance they didn't ask for. Let the silence carry your presence rather than erasing it. Every time you hold your ground while they withdraw, you are demonstrating the exact thing their nervous system has never encountered. Someone who doesn't need them to be different in order to be okay. When the thought surfaces, maybe I'm too much for them, let it be there without making a confession. Your emotional depth is not the liability you've been told it is. It is precisely the thing that is creating the pressure for change right now. Trust it. And when they start showing up differently, Don't immediately soften every boundary to welcome them back. Let them meet you where you actually are. Let that be real, not a performance of being easy. You are only effective in this process if it's backed by something real in you. The moment it becomes the role you're playing, it loses everything. And I know what you're thinking. What if my presence, my depth, my refusal to shrink is exactly what pushes them away for good? That fear makes sense. But here's what holding on to it is actually costing you. When you shrink your emotional reality prematurely, when you start to form an attachment to match their distance, you erase the one thing that was finally creating real movement. You reset the dynamic to the one where you're manageable and they're comfortable staying defended. An avoidant whose system is already failing because of who you are will not interpret your emotional depth as suffocation. They will interpret it as the thing they have never been able to walk away from cleanly. And if they ultimately retreat because you refuse to be less than you are, they were never capable of the relationship you actually needed. And you have lost nothing you could have kept without destroying yourself. Let's bring this home. Avoidant healing doesn't happen through more patience or more space. It happens through encountering something their system was never built to handle. Not chaos, not pursuit, groundedness, presence, emotional truth that doesn't need their permission to exist. You are not waiting to be chosen. You are being fully, groundedly, unapologetically. And that is what creates the conditions for real change. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen an avoidant respond differently when you stopped managing their comfort? Did something shift when you held your ground? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. If this video gave you something real, subscribe. Next week, we're talking about the specific moment an avoidant realizes they've actually changed and what that looks like from the inside. That breakdown is going to shift how you see everything. I'll see you there.